Hello and welcome to the webinar, Rapid Techniques for Mapping Experiences. My name is Emilia Åström and I'm Design Success Manager at Mural and I will be your host today. So mapping your customers' experiences helps you to see things through their eyes and to spot opportunities for growth. But creating a map doesn't have to take long. Within just days, you can have a diagram to use in design sprints and other team activities. In this webinar, Jim Callback, Head of Customer Success at Mural and author of the book Mapping Experiences, will show you how you can be confident that your solutions will address real-world problems, but in half of the time. But before I hand it over to Jim, I just wanted to highlight a few more things. During the webinar, please follow us on Twitter at Mural and use the hashtag Mapping Experiences if you want to tweet about this. And if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A pane of the webinar software. I'll be back at the end of the webinar to take some of your questions live to make sure to add your questions and you will get them answered by Jim. But now, let's get started. Over to you, Jim.
Great, thanks Amelia. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Jim Callback, Head of Customer Success, and we're going to be talking about some of the topics in my book, Mapping Experiences. In particular, I'm going to talk about some rapid techniques. So here's a brief agenda of what we're going to talk about. I'll give a little bit of background to mapping experiences, and then I'm going to talk about a process, and that's going to form the majority of the presentation. We'll be talking about the 4 steps in the process and how you can get through each one of those quickly. And then we'll take some questions at the end. So if you do have some questions, put them into the Q&A pane of the webinar software. We'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the session. So I have quite a bit to cover, and I'm going to jump right in. Start with one of my favorite quotes from Steve Jobs. He said in 1997, when he returned to Apple after having been asked to leave the company that he founded, "You've got to start with the customer experience and work back toward the technology, not the other way around." And I think with this, he gave us some insight into his strategy for turning Apple around, which was to kind of reverse the traditional way of developing software and products. Start with the customer and work back toward the technology. And for me, this really articulates or kind of indicates a change in the way that business gets done these days, particularly software, but also products and services, and that is focusing on the customer. And I think one of the lessons from Steve Jobs and Apple is the business value and the value in general of focusing on your customer. And it's not just the customer, it's their experiences as well too. So start with the customer experience and work back toward the technology. And this is, like I said, I believe a fundamental shift in how we're creating value, how businesses create value and capture value. And I liken this shift to Copernicus discovering that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. This is a diagram that the famous Polish astronomer created in 1543 to model out his observations of the universe. And he found that the planets actually revolve around the sun and not the other way around. And people realize they're just the third planet from the sun. And this really had a profound impact on the psyche of the time. And to communicate his idea, Copernicus created this diagram, which is one of the first infographics too, by the way. But he was trying to illustrate the phenomena in the universe that he observed, and he created a map. He created a diagram of the universe to show his new model. And I think that's what we do when we create things like this. This is a customer journey map created by Effective UI, and this is for a broadband provider. And I assume most people on the call have seen or even worked with this type of diagram. What you're trying to do is observe the world, just as Copernicus did, and create a diagram of it, create a model so that you can then describe and have a conversation of what you observed in the external world. So we have this idea of experience, which is a big fuzzy topic. and it's hard for people to get their head around it. And we create these diagrams to make it tangible so that we can then have a common understanding of what it means when we're talking about an experience. Whose experience? Which experience? When does it begin? How do we envision that? How do we model that out? So these types of diagrams then become a conversation point in our teams and in our organizations. But they don't have to be works of art, and it's not about artistic talent. So the mapping process that I'm going to talk about is really about involving others and creating a model that people can relate to. And if you're not able to illustrate a diagram quite, like the one I just showed, don't worry, you can still engage in mapping experiences. Here's an example of a diagram, a map created by Eric Berkman, the author of Designing Mobile Interfaces. And this is for the in-store experience at Starbucks. And you can see it's quite simple, but very effective. The top part of this diagram shows the positive and negative aspects of a Starbucks store, such as, waiting in line is a negative aspect, but the aroma is a positive aspect. And then the second half, the lower part of this diagram, lists all of the touch points and the activities that Starbucks has to provide in order to create that experience. So it's a very simple map that can be very effective for having those conversations in your organization. And again, that's really why we're doing the mapping exercise. We want to observe an experience, we want to capture it, understand it, and then use the diagram as a conversation point. That then becomes a springboard into ideation and innovation and change within your organization. Again, it's not about artistic ability. It's really about capturing the essence of the experience that you're observing and bringing it back into your organization. And that can even be as low fidelity as Post-its on a whiteboard. In this particular example uses a technique called user story mapping. Jeff Patton has a book called User Story Mapping, where in agile software development, you start with the experience at the top, and map out the steps of interaction that the customer might take with your service, and then map all of the features and functionality in the form of user stories down below in the middle part of it. But this, in my view, is still a map of the experience and trying to align the customer experience to what you're doing internally. It's really striving towards starting with the experience and working out the technology from there. So we have this range of techniques that I just call mapping experiences, and really what it tries to do is visually align an observed experience to something that the organization is trying to do internally. In this case, it's user story mapping for software development, but it also might be looking at a sales process or an onboarding process, or looking at workflow in an organization, or how the organization provides a service. All of those things, in my opinion, are mapping experiences. And the diagram, as I just mentioned, then becomes a conversation point. And it's not necessarily about creating a diagram. That's not the end goal. The end goal is to have the visualization so that you can come to a common understanding. So it's an important artifact and deliverable. But it's really the activity of mapping, which I see a lot broader as creating a diagram. I really see mapping as engaging others, right? It's then a design and an innovation tool and platform to have ongoing conversations in your organization. And it's really a full contact sport. It's really about getting out there and engaging others. So the diagrams become compelling documents that invite engagement by others. And the visualization aspect of that is very important, not just for coming up to a common understanding, but also to having something that's attractive that people want to engage with. So I want to present a framework, a model of how to go about doing this type of thing. We want to observe experiences that our customers have, or experiences out in the world, and we want to capture them in a visualization so that we can foster conversations in our teams and organizations. And here's a general approach to doing that. And I've broken it up into 4 phases. initiating the effort, and that's ensuring that you're getting the right target, that you're on track and you're relevant to the organization. Doing investigation, we want it to be grounded in reality, and we don't just want to make these things up. They need to reflect the real world. And then illustrating, creating that map, whether it's high fidelity or low fidelity. And again, it's not only about drawing skills and illustrating. Creating the map is all of these other things, both before and after creating that diagram. And it's really afterwards. It's aligning the team. It's aligning perspectives from an inside out to an outside in view of the market, of the customers, and then envisioning the future. What can we do? How can we improve? How can we innovate? So I really see mapping as, I focus on the verb of mapping and not the noun of the map. It's really about the activity and how that activity can engage other people. And that's really what I want to talk about using these 4 phases over the next 20 minutes or so. Because I often get the question, how long does it take? And you'll see at this level, when I'm just talking about these steps, I really call them modes of thinking. Because they could be iterative. Some could be shorter or longer than others, depending on your situation. You may have to do more investigation or less investigation, for instance. So there's no real time attached to these phases as I've presented them here. This could take months, and I've worked on very detailed projects where it has taken months, a lot of investigation, difficult to illustrate, but it can also take a matter of days. And that's what I wanted to talk about, is how do you move through these 4 steps in a very quick way. And I'm going to use these divisions here: initiate, investigate, illustrate, and align and envision, to discuss how you can do that quickly. So let's look at the first mode of thinking or stage, initiating an effort. And the goal here, and it's about keeping the goal in mind. What are we trying to do at this step in an effort? Assuming that we're engaging in a mapping effort. What you need to do is ensure that the diagram is relevant to the organization. I see a lot of efforts get off on the wrong foot because they're just creating a customer journey map because they heard that was the new cool thing they had to do, but it's not necessarily done in a way that's relevant to the organization. So it's really about thinking through, how are we going to create the right map for the right audience? And it really begins by answering these 5 questions. And this helps you frame the effort. I do have a blog post on this, on these 5 questions. If you want to know more about them, you can go to my blog, experiencinginformation.com, and you'll find the blog post, Mapping Experiences, 5 Key Questions to Getting Started. And those questions are: what's your point of view? When we talk about the word experience, like I said, it's a very complex and fuzzy concept, and you really need to zero in on whose experience you're going to be mapping and which experiences. And that's the first thing you need to decide. Sometimes that's obvious. If you have a simple service or a product, and it's in a B2C context, it may be very obvious on whose experience or which experiences. But in other larger complex systems or B2B contexts, for instance, it may not be clear whose experience you're going to map. And you need to really nail that before you get going. So answer the question: what's your point of view? What's the scope? When does this experience begin or end? And that's what I mean by the term scope. Where will you focus? There are different aspects of experience that you can focus on. It could be around the emotional experience. It could be around a particular type of experience, like a mobile experience as well, too. You're not going to be able to include everything in your diagram, so you have to limit it and focus it to what's relevant to the organization. And I think before you begin, you can also start thinking about how you're going to structure and represent the information, because the form of the diagram also has a message that you can include in there. And finally, the 5th question is: how are you going to use the map? Who's the audience for it, and what are you going to do with it as well, too? So it doesn't take long to go through these questions. Sometimes you might need to have a meeting with the stakeholder, but starting off with these 5 questions will help ensure that your effort is relevant to the organization. The next thing that I like to recommend that you can do fairly quickly is what I call a touch point inventory. Here's an example of one that Chris Risden from Adaptive Path created for a service called Rail Europe. And he simply went through the service and cataloged all of the touch points. And he did that in text. So this is just a simple table that you can do to take an inventory of the touch points in your system that you're trying to map out. And I just want to show another example of that. I'm just going to drag my browser in here because I wanted to show how you can use Mural to do a touch point inventory. I think Mural is a really good tool to do this type of analysis because you can include images and links in the document as well too. So instead of having an abstract representation of simply text in a table, I can actually go in here and, through the stages of interaction, include the current touch points in the form of a screenshot. So you can see I'm zooming in here on some screenshots that we've collected. This was an analysis we did for our own onboarding process. You can even include emails as well too, again as images or as text as well. Links, you can put them in here as well too. So Mural's a great visual way, and it really is about visualizing a lot of this work. That's a key component to drawing other people in, is to visualize them. And by doing this, then you can see new relationships and you can do an analysis and find the issues and the pain points as well too. So I think Mural is a great tool that you can use to do a touch point inventory, and it doesn't have to take very long. In fact, so if we talk about this initiation stage, if you want to go to the low end and ask yourself, how quickly can you get this done? Framing the effort, making sure that you have the right scope and focus and point of view might take a meeting or a discussion of about an hour. And if you have access to your current experience, you can take an inventory of the current touch points in about a half a day, a couple of hours. You can create that diagram that I just showed, that map that I just showed. So the initiation phase, it's very, very important. And again, I see a lot of projects getting off on the wrong foot because they don't answer those questions and they don't set it up right. So even if you're working rapidly, I guess the point here is to make sure that you frame the effort in the right way, but it doesn't have to take that long. About 4 hours is my estimate. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next phase, investigation. So we've set up the effort to target a certain user and a type of experience. Now we want to do some investigation to understand the experience. And really the goal here, and again, it's really about thinking about what the goal is and what's your quickest way to get to that goal, is to ground the map in reality. We don't just want to make this up. We want to be informed about how we're going to create these diagrams. And again, this can be done fairly quickly. I break this activity, this stage, down into 3 separate steps. And the first is to gather existing information. Very often organizations know a lot about the experience, and you can benefit from that and understand and learn from the organization. What do they already know? Try to get some existing reports or studies that are fairly recent that might give you clues into what the customer is experiencing. It might be kind of scattered information and diverse information that you have to piece together. But that's the value of the visualization of the map, is that it helps you bring in various types of information in different formats, and then you have it all in one place. But I think where you're going to spend most of your time is conducting internal interviews. And by that I mean within the organization, because we're really trying to look at how an organization aligns to a customer experience. We also have to understand how the organization works. So it's not just about doing the customer research, it's also about doing the organizational research. And the best maps that I've seen have a strong understanding of what is the business trying to do or the organization trying to do, and how do they do it. So in order to do that, you're going to have to do some internal interviews, get some stakeholders, a range of people, 3 to 5 people, and have some conversations with them about what they think the customer experience is, and also ask them about how do they provide that experience. And then finally, you're going to do some external interviews as well too. And this is where you want to spend most of your time, and that is talking to or observing customers. And again, this doesn't have to be a large sample size, doesn't have to be very long. If you're looking at interviews that are half an hour long, an hour long, you can do several of those in a single day. Just a couple of examples really quickly before I show the timings on that. When you're talking about stakeholder interviews, these are some photos from my own work in past projects where I sat down with some internal stakeholders and asked them to actually diagram the experience that we were talking about. And you'll see here, for instance, on the left side, this was kind of my sketches and my interview partner sketches that we were trying to work out a journey and a workflow together. And that's a great way to get people to talk. And it helps you then start thinking about how you're going to model and diagram the experience. doesn't take very long. You can sit down with a handful of stakeholders, half an hour, hour each, and get some information from them about what they think the experience is. But then with the customer interviews, I like to talk about, contextual inquiry or going on site. Obviously, that's going to take more time. So you could do phone interviews, or if it's a very, depending on your target market, if it's something you could observe, on the street, you might do some more guerrilla style observations and interviews, grabbing people in a Starbucks or in the hallway of an office and interviewing them as well too. But trying to get, again, that reality. What you're trying to do is get that reality into the diagram so that it's founded, it's based on real observations and data as quickly as possible. And here's kind of a minimum timeline. Reviewing existing resources, about a half a day. Doing some internal interviews, also about a half a day. And even in an 8-hour day, or maybe it's broken up across 2 different days, but you can get half a dozen interviews with external people. Really, really quickly, what you just want to do is get their impression, their understanding of their own experience, and inject that into your diagram. Bring that back into the organization. So initiate the project, answering those 5 questions, and then do some, at a minimum, do some investigation. Collect stories, get those external interviews done, and bring them back into your organization. Then what you're going to want to do is assemble that information into a diagram by illustrating it. And here it's really about visualizing the experience. And again, this isn't about artistic ability. It's about scoping it the right way, focusing on the right elements, and creating a model of the experience that everyone can understand, but also that they buy into, that they believe is a model of the experience. Because people support what they help create. So having a common model that everyone can relate to is very important. And the visual aspect of that is key here. So visualizing the experience is really critical to gaining that traction internally in your organizations. And in terms of the person whose experience you're mapping, I think a Proto Persona, if you don't know Proto Personas, you can Google that. Sometimes they're called assumption personas, where you're just making a hypothesis or an assumption about the user based on what you know today. So it's about capturing what you know about the customers and capturing that in a simple format. And this allows you to have a specific conversation to talk about a specific individual rather than talking about demographics or segment. So the Proto Persona activity is just a shorthand way to get to a representation of the customer as quickly as possible, and then using that as the basis for whose experience you're talking about. But you can also then create a draft version of your diagram, and you can do this together as a team. So in a half-day workshop, you can talk about the stories that you've heard in the field, the experiences that you've gathered, and engage a team of people to map out, create an initial model of the experience. And again, it can be low fidelity. In fact, sometimes that may even be better. I think sometimes there's a disadvantage to creating high fidelity maps in that stakeholders might think that it's quote unquote done, that they can't contribute to it. Again, people support what they help create. So if they're actually helping you create the model or the diagram, you'll get more support. And that's ultimately what it's about. It's about engaging the teams, right? There's no magic answer that's going to fall out of the diagram. It's not going to make decisions for you. The diagram is a conversation point, and it's an important visualization that you use as a springboard to have those conversations, but you need to have those conversations. And involving people as often and as early as possible, even creating a draft version of that diagram is important to getting momentum behind the team, getting everyone on the same page. So I just wanted to show another example in Mural. We've created a template. We call these templates, and that's when you take an entire mural. So I'm showing a mural now of an experience mapping exercise. And this is really to help a team go through some of the steps that I just talked about. In the upper left, we have a stakeholder map, and this is where you can have a conversation around those 5 questions that I talked about. Whose experience, which experience, when does it begin or end? So you can map out the stakeholders there. You see here, there's a Proto Persona on the left side here. where you could quickly get your assumptions about the target customer. You can get those down in the form of a Proto Persona. We've even included the empathy map up here in the upper right, where you can do an empathy map for each one of those persona. And then in the center, we have some swim lanes here set up in a kind of table-like form for the diagram, where you can have different stages of interaction. What are the steps, feelings, and pain points? You can change these if you want, depending on your focus. So when I talk about focus, by the way, I'm talking about more or less these rows of information. What are you going to focus on? In this one, I'm suggesting that steps, feelings, and pain points are 3 common focus points people tend to include in their map. There might be something else that you can add here. So this is a configurable template, but it's a template that you can use to get started really, really quickly as well too. This is also great, by the way, if you're working in remote teams. But again, it could be just low fidelity, and here what I would do is just add some sticky notes here, and together you can kind of build up a model of that journey. You might need to go validate that and go back out and do some user interviews or research to validate that. But you can use this template and the notion of a draft map to kind of get your initial assumptions and get a hypothesis out for the diagram that you're creating. And we hope that this mural template will help you do that quickly. Because that's really what we're talking about here, is trying to, how can we get this done as quickly as possible. So creating a Proto Persona doesn't take that long, a couple hours. You can have a discussion around it. And structure that discussion so you zero in on the most important attributes and things like that. And then in a half-day workshop, for instance, you can create a draft diagram either by yourself or with a team, start engaging people early on. So the illustration point, if we keep at a low fidelity, really, within a day, you can have a draft diagram that's still grounded in reality and structured in a way that is relevant to the organization. So the fourth and final phase, after you've initiated, investigated, and illustrated, is what I call align and envision. And the alignment is using the diagram to not only align towards the customer experience, remember, start with the customer experience and work back towards the technology, but it's also about getting team alignment. It's about getting your organization and others to have a common understanding, not necessarily to have your understanding, but that they create a shared meaning together, that they have a shared reality. That's what I mean when I use the term align there, really. It's about getting a team to have a shared reality about that customer experience. And then using that as a springboard to envision the future and develop concepts and ideas that make a difference for both the organization and the user. So really, the goal here is about working together to innovate. And again, if we keep the goals of each one of these stages in mind, you can think to yourself, how can I get that done as quickly as possible? Work together to innovate. I'm going to focus now on the notion of a workshop. So I almost always, when I do a mapping effort, I always build in a workshop, some session, an ideation session, brainstorming, innovation sprints. I have lots of different names for them. I think in my book I call them the alignment workshops. That's fine. You'll have your own labels for them, but you want to take the diagram that you create and engage others in activities around the diagram. And that's really what it's all about. That's that full contact sport aspect of this type of activity. It's not about creating a pretty picture. It's about engaging others. And you need to do that in a workshop type of situation, a real-time situation. Because what you're not going to do is send around an email to everyone and say, hey, what do you think about our diagram? What do you think about our map of the experience? You need to engage them in a conversation. So here's my diagram of the shape of that workshop. So let's say you're going to have a working session together with a team. You want to start by understanding the current experience, and I call that empathizing. Empathizing with the customer, empathizing with the situation, but also understanding the constraints that you have and that the customer has. And then diverge by coming up with ideas, come up with a volume of concepts, but evaluate them as quickly as possible. So prioritize them, but also represent them as sketches and artifacts that you can then test right away. And ultimately, you need to have ongoing experiments. So it's really about keeping that momentum going. And that's another area where I see a lot of projects get off track, is that they create the diagram, and it might look great and they might hold a workshop, but there's no follow-up plan. that there's no effort or team or initiative set up after this work session. The diagram and this workshop is just a point in an ongoing conversation, and you need to plan for that and follow through as well too. I'm just going to quickly run through those steps of the workshop. Empathizing, this is what these sessions look like, right? They're hands-on, people are standing up, they're pointing, they're adding to the diagrams, contributing. You want people to be contributing, and running thought exercises like dot voting. Where's the most important point for us? Where's the most critical point for the customer in their flow, in their experience? Using this as a springboard into conversations and really engaging the team. And that's when these deliverables, these documents become really valuable as a design and innovation tool. But it needs to be a working session. You need to think about, okay, we've identified these pain points or these critical moments or moments of truth in the experience. What can we do about it? What should we do about it? And this is where you can start representing ideas as sketches, as wireframes, as storyboards, even just writing out in text, writing out a scenario is something that you can do in these work sessions. And you can do that very, very quickly. Again, staying low fidelity, we're thinking about speed here. But finally, you want to evaluate them, and that could be prioritizing them on a matrix, like in the upper left there, where we did impact versus effort. But it could also be, inviting people into the workshop, which I've done, and I highly recommend, to test your concepts in real time. In the lower left here, this is actually a usability session in one of these workshops, where the workshop participants were watching a usability test of the idea that they created the day before. And with tools like Envision and prototyping apps, if you're working in software development, you can create a fairly robust prototype very, very quickly. So this gets us into the idea of design sprints. If you don't know the concept of design sprints, there are a couple of books out there. There's some resources on the web you can find if you Google design sprint. And here's a book by Richard Banfield and C. Todd Lombardo, along with Trace Wax from O'Reilly, simply called Design Sprints. And here's what they say, that mapping, and they're talking about mapping experiences, will add context to your project and highlight opportunities you may have otherwise missed. So they talk about design sprints, and this is a multi-day work session where you bring a diverse group of people together to focus on a specific aspect or problem or challenge that you're working on. And they point out the fact that these diagrams, these maps of the experience, can be a catalyst for those conversations. And that's really the point that I want to make today, is that you're really trying to foster conversations and use the diagram as a springboard into innovation and into coming up with improvements and new designs. And a design sprint, in my opinion, is kind of the culmination of the mapping exercise, and the two fit together really well. Here's an example of a 2-day sprint and a 3-day sprint that I typically run around the diagramming. So understanding what the customer experience is, envisioning the future, and then evaluating as quickly as possible. And you can even go through that cycle, empathize, envision, evaluate. You can go through that multiple times, even in just 2 or 3 days. So integrating, bringing these things together, mapping experiences and design sprints, and even ideas like lean as well too, because what we want to then do is plan experiments. And here's why we want to plan experiments, because you don't want the outcome to just be a wall of ideas, because ideas are overrated. In almost every organization that I've ever worked for or with, rarely has the problem of a lack of ideas. The volume of ideas is almost never the problem that our organizations have. It's about finding the ones that you can act on. But we have this Darwinistic view of ideas in an organization, right? We have this idea that the best ideas will win on their merit alone, right? This is a great idea, it has to win, but that's not the way it works. That the organization, there are forces inside the organization that will act to kind of squash your good ideas, that those good ideas need to be developed, and they need a greenhouse in which they can fully grow. And it's up to you and the map maker. So you've done the research, you've created the map, you need to follow through and give the ideas, the outcomes of your session, give them a chance to grow. Because the corporate antibodies and these forces inside of your organizations may be working against you in a silent way. So don't stop with ideas. Come up with concepts like I was talking about. I just want to talk about that all, put it all together, and then we'll take a break and ask some questions. But I just wanted to show an example in a previous company that I worked for, this idea of taking the ideas all the way to their end. I did a quick mapping exercise. Again, you can see this is a fairly low fidelity diagram here. It's essentially a big table with some nice color, but I put that up on the wall, and that was our conversation point. We started by understanding the user and the experience with this diagram. And then that became a springboard into brainstorming and innovation. And I've never had this situation where people were at a lack of ideas. When you put a diagram like this on the wall, people don't have a lack of ideas that they can then place around it. It's very easy to generate 50 or 100 ideas just by focusing on pain points or solving problems internally and those types of things. So this is then the springboard into those conversations. So you have the visualization and a common understanding of that, but then you need to take that further, write scenarios, make storyboards, create wireframes, create mock-ups. And you can do that in a matter of hours as well too. So that by the end of a first day of a sprint like this, you can have looked at the journey, understood it, brainstormed, and come up with some of the initial artifacts that you can then evaluate and test. Even bringing in users as soon as possible to help get you feedback there. But after this session, we did a 2-day session in this specific effort I'm talking about. We actually had a team of people that were ready to take the concepts that we prioritized afterwards. And for weeks afterwards, we worked on the idea even further, and it continued to develop. But we also did things like launching a video of the concept under the heading of a free beta and put it up on the web. And we actually published our idea and said, hey, are you interested in this free beta? Please sign up. And before we even had any code written, right? So this was actually ahead of the beta. We said, sign up for our beta. We were gathering input from the market as well too. But this happened after the workshop. And this starts getting into the notion of lean and lean startup and fake storefront and things like that as well too. And I think it's really up to us to tie all this together, to tie design thinking and mapping experiences and design sprints and lean. That needs to all be tied together, and we need to follow through and connect the dots all the way to the conclusion. So tying it all together. And again, Mural is a great place to do that. This is an image of a mural where you can move from the experience map and personas into brainstorming, into clustering, and even gathering feedback and keeping that all in one place. And of course, with Mural, it's all online and it's digital as well too. So that really helps you do that. So the rapid mapping process: initiating, investigating, illustrating, aligning, and envision. Let's say at a half day, you can set up the project. You might need a couple of days to do some guerrilla style investigation, create a draft diagram really quickly, take that into a workshop, a 2-day workshop, but also plan after that, what's going to happen after that. And do that before you even start the effort. That's part of your effort, is that arrow on the right. What's going to happen afterwards? How are we going to test our assumptions? Because what you end up with are still hypotheses and assumptions. They're not ready to be implemented at the end of this cycle. You need to prove those out and develop them further. So just to summarize, because I do want to leave some time for some questions, it's really about thinking about the goals of those stages that I talked about. Ensure that the effort is relevant to the organization, set it up correctly, and then ground the diagram and your picture of the experience in reality. But create a visualization of it, because that's a great way, a compact way to bring a lot of information together and have a conversation, common understanding, a shared reality of that experience, so that the team can then innovate and improve. But you need to then follow through with that and develop and validate those ideas on an ongoing basis. So I had a subtitle on my opening slide of the webinar, which was, I didn't point it out then, but it's the destination and the journey. So yeah, it's about creating a visualization. It has to be based in reality. The map is important, but it's the journey around the map that I would say is almost more important. It's both of those things together as well too. By understanding what you're trying to do at this level, I think you can move through those stages as quickly as possible. And within a matter of days or 2 weeks, let's say, you can go from a mapping effort to activating that and using that in a team. So thanks everyone for joining. I'd like to ask Amelia to come back on. I do see some activity here in my webinar software. I hope that was useful. And I'd like to try to get to some of your questions. I'm sure we probably won't get to all of them, but what are people asking, Amelia?
Hi, Jim.
Hey.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We have a lot of interesting questions about process here, but I would like to start with one question first. Maybe we can try to answer them quite quickly so we can get through some more questions. But I would like to start with this one from Vinu, who's wondering, existing journey maps are really overwhelming and not easy to digest. How would you say that your output is different from others?
It may not be, and I do know the problem of overwhelming stakeholders, and that's part of the question. How are you going to use the diagram? I talked about those 5 questions at the beginning, and one of the things you need to reflect on is who's the audience for this information. And what you don't want to do is overshoot and include too much detail. That if you're dealing with a set of stakeholders where they just need a high level understanding, which is also a valid understanding to have at a high level, what's the journey, what's the customer's experience, you can create a diagram that matches those expectations. So that's why setting it up and thinking about who's going to use the diagram and how am I going to present this is very important for determining how much level of detail do you want to have. But one thing that I very often find too is that you have multiple levels of detail. So you might have a high-level model that's really just a couple of boxes on a page in one case, and that's great for the PowerPoint presentation or the executive version. But you might have a more detailed diagram as well too, with a lot of sub-steps and details. And that's typically what I like to bring into a workshops type of situation, is the more detailed diagrams as well too. So if you are going to end up with a design sprint type of a workshop, I think it's okay to have a little bit more detail and use that as part of the exercise. Take an hour and read through it slowly, that type of thing as well too. But it's really about matching expectations up front and making sure you have the right level of granularity.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Ron here that came in already in the beginning of the webinar. How do you ensure you use the right focus? Do you have any particular advice to define right focus for the organization?
Yes, I do, and I think that's to some degree interviewing or looking at the organization and maybe talking to some of the stakeholders, the project sponsor, the project initiator, talking to them about their goals first of all, as well as their gaps in knowledge. And what the diagram as a whole, but particularly what you're going to focus on, what that should highlight is what's most relevant to the business. So businesses are always looking to grow. Right? They might grow into different markets or new products or new services, or expand a current service into different areas. And with that expansion, with that growth comes uncertainty, a gap in knowledge. And the focus of a diagram will have the most impact if it addresses that gap in knowledge. So that does mean syncing up and coordinating with the project sponsor, and with just understanding the organization and what the gaps in knowledge are and what their goals are, understanding that in advance and scoping and framing the effort so that it has the most impact and addresses those gaps in knowledge.
Great, thank you. And then we have a couple of similar questions here that I would like to address at the same time. Let's see. So do you have any real-life examples of the best way of convincing internal stakeholders of usefulness of such experience mappings?
Yes, I do. I mean, from my own experience, and the book, my book is basically the culmination of about eight or more years of having done this in lots of different contexts, internally in large organizations, externally as a consultant with a design agency. So I do have some examples, I think, in the book. But from my own experience, here's what I can say about that. This is the type of work that sometimes stakeholders like to know and maybe even need to know, but they don't know they need it until they actually see it. So there's a little bit of a dilemma, because you need their approval or resource or time or money from them to do the type of work, and they don't know the value until after you're done with that. So it's really about one thing that I do recommend is trying to do a project or an effort under the wire, or as part of another effort. And very often, by the way, I've framed mapping experience as its own thing, and I've done a lot of projects like that. But very often, it's part of another effort as well, to a larger research effort. Or you might be doing, you might have design sprints set up, and you want to bring a diagram into that design sprint already. So very often, these are part of other efforts, and I think that's a great way to get started, because then when people do see the map of the experience, that visualization that's compelling and attractive, then they say, ooh, I want that. But, to be honest with you, I'm hearing more and more, I'm hearing people ask for this type of thing. Stakeholders, clients, if you're working, as an external freelancer or consultant, clients are asking for these things by name. They say, hey, we need a customer journey map. They're not even curious. They're saying we need it. So I think the demand is starting to shift, so that we're becoming more and more expected to be doing these type of things. But if you don't have that situation, I think what you need to try to do is come up with a pilot activity, come up with an example that you can then show the value of it. You can show around and get more of that type of work. And that's why these rapid techniques are really important, to understand what you're trying to do and how can you get to that point as quickly as possible, because you may not have the bandwidth or the budget or the time from the outset.
Cool, thank you. And related to, you mentioned that you could tie this into interview activities or user research. Axel has a question about what is the effort that you spend into creating the interview guides for the investigation phase, and how long does the analysis of the result take?
Yeah, that's
advice on this.
I do. I think the approach that I'm suggesting here is that you're doing it very intuitively. So you would definitely have a research guide, interview guide, and the types of interviews that I like to do are open-ended and more qualitative of nature. But that doesn't mean you don't have a guide. So you would still want to pick up on those themes. And I think that's where framing the effort comes from. So if the experience begins at one point and ends at another point, and it's for a certain type of customer, and you're going to focus on specific aspects. So framing that effort, I think the discussion guide should almost come out of that framing of the effort. And you can have very simple questions depending on what your focus is around. If you're focused on emotions, you're going to want to ask about that, right? So I think there are some natural things that will fall out of the initiating phase into the investigation phase. And depending on the level of formality, you may need to do more reviewing of the interview guide with stakeholders and things like that, which is going to, obviously expand your timelines beyond what I'm showing here. What I'm suggesting here is that if you're working in a small team, informal project, you can get to that point really quickly. But you do want to make sure you're asking the right questions. In terms of analysis, though, you can spend an enormous amount of time analyzing qualitative data. I've done a lot of that myself, and I know you can spend days and days doing that analysis. What I'm suggesting here is, though, you kind of collect stories and sources of information and sort through them together in real time. And that's really one of the functions of that draft map session that I showed. It's really about people various people bringing information to the table and kind of doing the analysis almost in real time.
Thank you. And then we had a couple of questions about the murals that you showed earlier in the presentation. Do you have any advice on how you could do such a rapid experience mapping activity in Mural, doing the interviews with the stakeholders or the users through mobile phone or through a conference call?
Yeah, I would recommend, we do have a new mobile capability that would allow you to add sticky notes to a mural. And if you are out in the field, that's a great way to use Mural. I think you would be able to set up a mural in advance. And as you're gathering thoughts, you can add them to the mural regardless of where you are. But I think Mural, and we do see a lot of people using Mural for user research in general. That's a fairly common use case that we see. And I think for developing, the basis of a map as well too, you could use Mural to collect the information and the data that you collect out in the field, by setting up a mural that multiple people can contribute to, like I mentioned, engaging other people in these activities as well, and using Mural to digest it and almost do the analysis in real time. I think something that's very visual helps very often. That you can get your thoughts out really quickly and do it as rapidly as possible. And Mural really helps facilitate that as well too, because it's visual and it's accessible anywhere. Anybody can contribute to it from wherever they are.
Thank you. Tim was also wondering, can you show examples of storyboard slides or use of canvases when you integrate mapped content?
When you integrate mapped content, do I have any examples? I don't think I have any examples here that I can show right now. But for me, and I talk about this a little bit in the book too, the value of storyboarding. I just want to point out that what I was presenting here and what I was talking about was focused mostly on understanding the as-is experience, understanding the current experience that people have. And diagramming that out. And I think that's an important step towards empathy, towards understanding, the current state of the world, and focusing on that, and then using that as a springboard into envisioning the future. And I often get the question: do you need a version of your experience or of the diagram that reflects the future? And the answer is you might. But typically what I find is that you want to see kind of the current state and the future state, or the as-is state and your envision state. You might even want to see those next to each other. So you see cause and effect. Here's the current experience. We've come together and envisioned a new experience, and you can very, very often continue and map that right below or right next to that as well too. And storyboarding is one way to express that future state as well too. So you can use storyboarding as a way to say, okay, if we know that these are the pain points or the trouble spots that we want to address in the future, how might that look? And then use the storyboard to kind of envision the future and to visualize the future state as well. So the visualization aspect of storyboards, I think, fits in with the type of activity that I'm doing, that I'm talking about, which is really trying to get a group of people together and understand and experience first the as-is, the current state, but then using something like a storyboard to envision the future state as well.
Great, thank you. Do we have time for a couple of more questions?
Yeah, let's take another question and before we end, Amelia.
Cool. Liz is wondering, what kind of metrics do you set to validate the customer journey map's accuracy? Would you be able to give some examples?
Yeah, that implies a kind of a quantification of some of the information in the map, which may be valid, and that's why I say do things like look at the current resources or current information that you have. When you do your investigation, what you want to do is understand what information you currently have, right? And that may be metrics, right? You want to look at conversion rates, or if it's a website, you want to look at different web metrics, or churn rates and things like that. So you may have those metrics that you can bring into the diagram. So I think those are some metrics that you can bring into the activity as well too. But validation doesn't have to be quantitative only. That you can do a qualitative validation as well too. That would obviously require more time, but the way that I've done that in the past is to do a set of interviews with stakeholders, internal, external, come up with ideas around a model and secondary questions that you want to validate with them, then go back to them in the second round, which can be more of like a focus group or in pairs. That's the way I've done it in the past, where you'll go back to them and validate the ideas qualitatively as well too with them, your understanding of their experience and of the model as well. And I think there there can be metrics that you would include. And again, just some of the ones that come to mind are things like conversion rates, churn rates, usage, frequency, things like that. Depending on your focus, you can bring that into the mapping effort. You can also bring qualitative validation into the effort. But I think there's another type of validation that tends to get overlooked, and that's the validation of the model by the team. Because I've seen great journey mapping or experience mapping work done that's all valid and based on a ton of research, but it didn't get accepted in the organization because the model was either too complex, or they didn't buy into it, or they didn't believe in it. So, I always say that it's better that a team has the same information than new information, which kind of means that as long as the team has a shared sense of reality and it's based on reality, it's not made up, and it's valid data. That for me is more valuable than making sure that every data point has a source that you can tie it back to, which is not a bad thing to do. But I just wanted to point out the fact that there's also internal validation. Is this the model of the world that we want to work to? Because there's also strategic questions that come out of the mapping exercise potentially. And that, those strategic questions may or may not be 100% based on just a data point. It may be around what position do we want to have in the marketplace? What do we believe as a company is right or wrong? And those types of things too. So there is a set of qualitative criteria that the organization needs to buy into as well too. That's an important type of validation. So I see we're at the end of the hour, Amelia. Thanks for joining me and for hosting the event and asking the questions. It's great to have you here as always, Amelia.
Thank you. Thank you for the great presentation. Very interesting and insightful as usual.
Fantastic, and I hope everybody on the call found it interesting and insightful as well too. We will be posting a recording of this session on our blog. That's blog.mural.ly, and you'll see a little bit of information along with the recording. We're sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions. We'll try to answer some of them maybe offline, but really appreciate everyone for coming out today. And with that, we'll end the session. So have a good day, everyone, and bye-bye.